rent a house. So in other words, Rome wasn't paying for that, but they allowed him. And I was thinking, if you remember, there was a centurion that was assigned to guard Paul. His name was Julius, and he seemed to be a pretty sensible guy. And by the time he had been with Paul through all that stuff on the ship, and, you know, I'm sure his impressions of Paul rose to the heights. And maybe it was even the same guy that volunteered to stay with Paul. At any rate, we do know that he was always under guard, but he had the freedom for these 2 years to live in this house and to just, you know, host people and to preach and teach, and you know, just a wonderful situation. Not bad for being a prisoner. I guess you could say he was sort of a political prisoner, or what do you call that? Well, he wasn't in jail. It wasn't like Wayne was talking about this morning, you know, where he was in this rat-infested dark dungeon. He had this freedom. So God was good to him in that sense. Well, let's continue, starting in 17. 3 days later, after he gets to this house that he's staying in, and he gets established, he called together the local Jewish leaders. And when they had assembled, Paul said to them, "My brothers, although I have done nothing against our people or against the customs of our ancestors, I was arrested in Jerusalem and handed over to the Romans. They examined me and wanted to release me because I was not guilty of any crime deserving death. The Jews objected, so I was compelled to make an appeal to Caesar. I certainly did not intend to bring any charge against my own people. For this reason, I have asked to see you and talk with you. It is because of the hope of Israel that I am bound with this chain." Verse 21. And they replied, "We have not received any letters from Judea concerning you, and none of our people who have come from there has reported or said anything bad about you. But we want to hear what your views are, for we know that people everywhere are talking against this sect." So this kind of sets up the situation. Paul is recounting once again. I don't know how many times Paul had to give his testimony and kind of summarize his life. Every time he stood before somebody, he had to explain what was going on. So he does it again here. And he reminds them that his last trial was before Felix and then eventually Festus. And he tells the whole story about how they examined him. You know, the Romans examined him. They found nothing that they could charge him with, and they were willing to let him go, except for the fact that he appealed to Caesar. And that bought him a one-way, all expenses paid trip to Rome, which, you know, is all part of God's sovereign plan. So it's just kind of interesting to see how this develops as he now is in Rome, and he has the freedom, I guess, pretty much to do whatever he wants. But it seems curious to me that the first people he calls upon were the Jewish leaders. And this whole account from Luke's perspective doesn't really say much about the Roman influence in this supposed trial. I mean, he was supposed to go to appeal to Caesar, and you would have expected maybe right away, that, like they did in Caesarea, that they would have brought him before somebody to hear him out. But in this case, Paul invites these Jewish leaders, and I think we noticed before that there was kind of a change in Paul's emphasis through his journeys, that he began by simply going all to every single synagogue and preaching to the Jews. And he got a little fed up with, you know, some of them would believe, but most of them wouldn't. And eventually that sort of directed his attention to the Gentile world. Remember the call to Macedonia. He was ready to go up further into Asia. The Lord put him on another detour. And then it seemed like Paul's message was much more oriented to the Gentiles. So we're seeing this pattern, and you would think by this time that he would be so fed up with the Jews that why would he want to entertain them again? But he still felt this need to, I guess, kind of clear his reputation amongst these Jewish believers. So there were two things in this particular passage that I underlined, and one of them is it is because of the hope of Israel that I am bound with this chain. That's kind of a curious statement. And then the other one is the fact that these Jews came and said, we want to hear what your views are. So God, I think Paul was trying to identify with these Jewish, and these were not necessarily Jewish believers. These were people that just wanted to hear what this guy Paul was all about. And remember, in the Roman Empire, they didn't have like TV or internet, and so you couldn't just follow somebody, on their blog or whatever. Everything they knew about Paul had to come from somebody else, from word of mouth. And everything that had been going on in the Roman Empire by this time, after all these decades, this whole Christianity thing was a big part of the daily newscast. And of course, the way they got their newscast was just by word of mouth. And, these trials and these events that Paul would hold became his way and their way of understanding who he was. So Paul invites these Jewish leaders, and they say, yeah, we're anxious to hear what you have to say. So this is, I think it's kind of interesting how the Lord gives him this opportunity once again. It's another open door. And this, the whole tendency away from the preaching to the Jews and going towards the Gentiles, he sort of puts that on hold for this particular time. But that phrase, it is because of the hope of Israel that I am bound with this chain, that shows up before in Acts 24, where in verses 15 to 16 he said, and this was as he was standing before Festus, and I have the same hope in God that they themselves, the Jews, that there will be a resurrection of both the righteous and the wicked. In this hope, I strive always to maintain a clear conscience before God and man. And then a few verses later, otherwise let these men state for themselves any crime they have found in me when I stood before the Sanhedrin, unless it was this one thing I called out as I stood in their presence. It's concerning the resurrection of the dead that I am on trial for you today. I guess that's appropriate since we're just coming very close to Easter. But this was kind of a curious thing to say. Why am I really here? What is the essence of the case that they have against me? And in one case he said it's because of the hope of Israel that I have. And the other has to do with the subject of the resurrection of the dead. I was trying to actually wrap my mind around that. And this might be a good project for some of our young theologians to dig into. How is this subject of the resurrection of the dead related to, Paul being in prison? Because he says that's the reason. And one theory that I've come up with is that in the Old Testament, the story of Christ can be clearly seen. In fact, if we look at earlier in the book of Acts in chapter 3, this is Peter speaking. He said, indeed, all the prophets from Samuel on, as many as have spoken, have proclaimed these days, what was going on then at Pentecost. And you are the sons of the prophets and of the covenant God made with your fathers. He's speaking to the Jews at this time. When he said to Abraham, through your offspring, all the families of the earth will be blessed. And when God raised up his servant, he sent him first to you to bless you by turning each of you from your wicked ways. So you see what Peter was saying there is this message that you're hearing right now should have been known to you if you just read the scriptures. That comes from your own scriptures. It comes from the mouths of all these prophets that you have a habit of killing. If he kind of gets into that a little bit later. So the point is, and I think this was what the point Paul was making, is that this whole subject of the resurrection of the dead was really the dynamic power behind the gospel at that time. We saw a person who was dead come back to life and promise us that we could have the same experience. This was the dynamic power behind the message of the church at this time. And it really wasn't contradicting anything the Old Testament said. The problem was that those Jewish leaders at that time, should have seen it, but they didn't. And that brings us to this next subject that Paul gets into, regards to the hope of Israel. And we start now